everyone, I'm Dr Becky Appleton, and today I'm going to talk you through the stages of setting up a survey or questionnaire and two main approaches used to analyse survey data. To start off with, it's useful to know when to use a survey rather than some other different types of data collection. And one of the main considerations is how many people do you want to be able to speak to as part of your research, and does this data already exist or not? Surveys are particularly useful when you want to hear from someone's thoughts or experiences, but perhaps interviews aren't appropriate or feasible. This could be because it's a particularly sensitive topic, or you have a large geographic variation across your participants. They're also helpful when you want to be able to gather data from a medium to large sample, so maybe more than 20 participants. Surveys can also be used if you want to gather either quantitative data, so figures, or qualitative data, so people's written responses or thoughts. You can also combine both of these approaches into one survey. As I mentioned, surveys can be useful if you want to collect data from a variety of different people across different settings. And one example is a survey which recruited over 2,700 participants across several different countries to assess healthcare professionals' experiences of working during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this case, a survey was used because it wasn't feasible to go and speak to people individually, and also they wanted to get a really large sample of as many healthcare professionals as possible. Whilst a sample of this size may be beyond your particular work, it could be really useful if you want to capture the thoughts of people working across different settings or different NHS trusts. Here's another example where a survey has been used to gather information from the general population. So this was a study which was conducted to identify barriers to lifestyle change for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. And this included both quantitative and qualitative questions. The researchers compiled a list of different types of barriers identified from previous literature, and respondents were asked to state whether each of these barriers applied to them or their situation. There was also a free text box for participants to identify additional barriers, so to write down their own thoughts and information. And I'll now provide some information about how you can practically set up a survey and collect this type of data. There are a few key practicalities you need to consider when setting up your survey. Firstly, what platform will you use to host the survey? So how will you physically enter these questions and send the survey link out to your participants? Examples of this can be something like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. You'll also need to decide how many participants you will need and who they are. So what are your eligibility criteria? And how will you make sure that it's only people who are eligible who will actually take part in this survey? For this, I can caution against posting a survey link online, especially if you're offering some kind of voucher or money as a thank you, as this means you can get people who pretend to meet your chosen criteria completing your survey just to receive this award. And thinking back to the examples I spoke about in the previous slide, you'll need to think about whether you want to choose open or fixed responses. So open responses could be things where people are asked to enter their own free text responses, whether fixed responses are things like a Likert scale where you select one option from a range which is already there. So this could be when measuring satisfaction, how satisfied were you with a particular service, from not at all to very satisfied. An example of using fixed responses in surveys is that you have consistency across all of your participants, because people are only selecting from the options you've presented to them. Whilst open-ended questions and free text responses can be really valuable for certain research questions, sometimes they can make the data harder to analyse, as people might have said different things completely from each other, and some of them may also have not answered the exact question that you asked. Therefore, sometimes a combination of both open and fixed responses is the best approach. You may also need ethical approval for your survey, particularly if this counts as research rather than a service evaluation. I've made a separate presentation on research ethics, which has a link to a flowchart which can help you to decide whether your study is classed as research or not. Moving on to designing your survey questions. You really want to make sure that they are as clear and concise as possible, and that people are able to easily understand what you mean. It can be helpful to involve your PPI group or people with lived experience in designing your survey questions, and you may also want to pilot your survey amongst a couple of colleagues or people from your PPI group before you send it out to all your potential participants. This way you can identify whether there are any issues or whether anything maybe doesn't quite make sense. You will also need to consider whether you want to collect anonymous or confidential information, and how you will make sure that all data collected is stored securely. If you choose to collect anonymous data, this means that no identifiable information is collected about any survey respondent. This means that things like names, ages, email addresses, or perhaps profession aren't collected as part of your survey. However, there might be certain situations where you actually want to collect some of this data. For example, if you want to group your participants into certain subgroups based on their particular characteristics. In this case, you would conduct a confidential survey, where some identifiable information is collected, but kept secure and known only to the researcher or other members of the research team. It's vital to make sure that any personal data is stored securely and can't be accessed by others. So, for example, you can do this by putting it in a password-protected document and ensuring any identifying information, for example, somebody's name or email address, is stored separately to the rest of their information. Now moving on to analysing and presenting your data. So you've sent out your survey and you've gathered all of your survey responses. Here are the next steps. Firstly, I find it easiest to export all your data to an Excel file. There is some survey platforms which allow you to do some kind of basic data analysis within them, but I always find it easiest to export to Excel first, as this means you can clean your data, so remove any responses where people actually might have started but only answered the first question, or the survey sites will often collect things like the time the survey was conducted or how long a participant spent completing it, which you probably won't need for your analysis. The next step is to do some basic descriptive statistics, including the amount of missing data. So if you're collecting quantitative data, this could be the mean response for particular questions. And it can also involve describing your sample, so who actually took part in your survey. The next step, if appropriate, could be analysing qualitative or free text responses. And there are two main approaches to this: content analysis or qualitative framework analysis, both of which I will now go on to explain further. I'll start with content analysis, which works by transforming qualitative data into numerical data, which is distinct from other forms of qualitative analysis, where you're grouping responses according to similar themes. Content analysis works well when you're analysing open-ended survey questions, but you might have slightly shorter responses than interviews, or where you've asked quite an open question with a large free text box where somebody could say quite a lot in response. It can be useful if you're trying to identify patterns or trends across respondents, because you're able to look at counts and frequencies across your data. And it can also be used for combining both qualitative and quantitative insights. So if you're conducting a mixed method survey, you can transform your qualitative data to be more similar to your quantitative data as well, which can be nice for consistency when analysing and writing up your survey responses. Here is an example of what content analysis might look like. So thinking about an example research question of how do medical students perceive the benefits and challenges of using digital tools in their learning? And step one in content analysis is deciding on the unit of analysis. So, for example, each idea or each clause within a free text response will be treated as one unit. The next step involves assigning short descriptive codes to each unit, and you can see an example of that in the table here. So this is where we have one idea on the left, where somebody has said, online videos and apps make it easier to review complex topics. And this has been assigned the code ease of understanding or learning support. Similarly, in the example below, somebody has said, I get distracted by social media. And this has been coded as digital distraction. Once you've finished doing this for all of your data, you then group your codes into categories. And again, you can see a couple of examples here. So for the category of learning enhancement, we have codes included such as ease of understanding and enhanced visual learning. The next category, barriers to effective use, contains the codes digital distraction, concentration difficulty, and technical issues. And you can also see that I've included some example quotes here. I should also make it clear that this is from fictional data. Hopefully this is a nice example which shows how you get from your individual quotes, so this could be survey response, into your codes and then into your overarching categories. And finally, you can see here that the last step is summarising frequencies. So in this fictional example, 8 out of 25 respondents included information about learning enhancement, and 20 out of 25 spoke about barriers to effective use. Moving on to the next example, I'm going to talk you through thematic framework analysis. So this is a type of qualitative analysis which, as I mentioned earlier, involves grouping responses according to similar themes. And this is useful when you have a pre-existing theory, or you want to answer more focused rather than exploratory research questions. And this is really a distinction between something like thematic framework analysis or more pure thematic analysis, which is more exploratory. However, within framework analysis itself, you can involve both deductive and inductive methods. So inductive thematic analysis involves building themes from the bottom up. So ideas for categories and themes come directly from your data. You come to the study with no preconceived ideas about what you might find or how you might organise your data. Deductive analysis, on the other hand, involves applying pre-existing theories or frameworks in a more top-down method. This could be to test hypotheses, or it could be organising your data in a way that makes sense according to your research questions. Examples of this include things like when you're trying to identify barriers or facilitators, benefits or challenges of a method, etc. And in this way, you use a defined structure to identify and find your themes. Hopefully this will become a bit clearer now as we work through the rest of this example. So, using our same research question as before, how do medical students perceive the benefits and challenges of using digital tools in their learning? We'll start with 4 broad themes. So these could be things that we're interested in particularly, or factors that we've also identified might be important, for example, by reviewing previous literature. And these themes we've got are perceived benefits, the learning process, because perhaps we're really interested in looking at how do people use this in practice and how do these digital tools actually impact the way students learn information. Again, we want to know about barriers or challenges. That's clearly stated in our research question. And also contextual factors. So, for example, it might be that digital tools work best in certain situations rather than others, and it might be useful that we can identify this during our analysis. You'll notice that this looks fairly similar to the table I presented on content analysis. However, in practice, things are done slightly differently. So you have your text segments on the left-hand side, so your survey responses, and you assign these to your pre-existing framework categories rather than coming up with new codes from the data. You can see here, for example, that the comment, "I find it hard to stay focused," has been coded under the barriers and challenges theme. And unreliable Wi-Fi during lectures has been given a couple of different framework themes, so both contextual factors and barriers and challenges. It's good practice to also take some notes when you're doing this stage of thematic framework analysis, as this can help you in the next step when it comes to identifying and writing up your themes. Once you've done this for all of your survey responses, step 3 involves identifying key patterns and relationships across the framework to interpret your findings. And step 4, the final step in thematic framework analysis, involves interpreting and writing up your findings. So here is a short excerpt from what this could look like in the results section of a paper or report. You can see the theme heading of perceived benefits, and this is what you might write. So most respondents describe digital tools, for example, videos, apps, virtual anatomy resources, as valuable for improving understanding and visualization of complex material. And you can see here that we've gone from slightly separate codes and categories into something which is cohesive and pulls together all of your data. That's all for this topic. However, there is a separate video in this series on qualitative research and qualitative analysis if you'd like to find out more about any of these methods. Here are a couple of articles which describe both content analysis and framework analysis, so I really recommend looking at these if you want to use either of these methods further. And finally, you can see the direct link on screen to the catalogue hosted on NHS's Learning Hub platform. Registration is free, and if you have an NHS email, you'll have free access to both the Learning Hub as a whole and the WE-R NHS catalogue resources. We have links to podcasts, videos, and journal articles on a range of topics related to education and workforce research. WE-R NHS is also on YouTube, and we have a regular e-newsletter. Thanks very much for watching.